Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the PetroNerds podcast. This is episode 145 of the PetroNerds podcast. My name is Trisha Curtis. I am the CEO of PetroNerds and the host of the PetroNerds podcast, and I am super pumped and delighted to be with you here today because today is Monday, November 17th, 2025. Oil prices are not looking great. They're sitting at $59 a barrel and change, but there's a lot of ground to cover to catch you up on the market. So if you have not listened to the latest PetroNerds podcast, please do. There's a ton of intel in here that's really building on each other. And I'm getting incredible feedback on the podcast, both from the viewers that are watching it to those that are listening on multiple platforms. So thank you guys so much for listening. But today we're going to dive in because I have a market recap for you of a lot of things happening in the market, a lot of my travels and things that have happened since I left and got on the road on November 5th. Been to a lot of places since then. And then this podcast is the fireside chat that I did with Whitley Penn. This is in Dallas. This was with Buffie Campbell with Whitley Penn. Really, really good. And I say this because she asked great questions and we were just really able to dive into a lot. And the timing of this was really important because there was a lot happening on October 16th, 2025. And this was where we had this dip down in oil prices. And so it's a really great conversation to kind of like take a pause and look back and see where we were at and what was going on. So I think you guys are really going to, you're really going to enjoy it. This is an absolute energy dense PetroNerdy podcast. So buckle up. But right now, I'm going to catch you up and try to be relatively tight on this. And then I'll tell you, kind of the highlights of this fireside chat. But before we get into that, in the fireside chat, we cover the gauntlet of absolutely everything, geopolitics, China, you name it. But there's a lot going on right now. So this week, we are going to have Mohammed bin Salman, the de facto leader. He's not actually the king, but he's going to be the king at some point. The Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, also known as MBS, is coming to the U.S. to meet with Trump. I believe that's tomorrow. So that's the single biggest visit he's had since the killing of Jamal Khashoggi in their embassy. So this is like that's a relatively big deal, but this is really about the meeting. This is really about Mohammed bin Salman meeting with Trump, and this is really about the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the U.S. A lot to do with energy, a lot not to do with energy as well. The Saudi Arabia wants a lot of weapons and systems from the U.S. They've been wanting that for a long time. But importantly, today, Monday, November 17, 2025, we are looking at WTI West Texas Intermediate at 59.91. We keep flirting up with about 60, 61, 62 when we drop back down. I think there's some support levels here. We're not seeing this really break below 59. And I'm not saying it can't. We've seen 58 recently, but I'm just saying this is not, a lot of folks were calling for when we saw 57 that we would go down to 50. And that didn't happen. And that's because, from a supply and demand standpoint, we're not there, right? We're not at this like crazy, problematic demand standpoint. We do have a lot of supply, but the demand standpoint is where it is. It's not cratering, even though there's a lot of question marks in the global economy, which you'll hear throughout this podcast and this keynote I did in Dallas. So Brent is 64.04. So we've moved down in oil prices. We're oscillating around this. We are absolutely 100% oversold by $5 easily. There's so much geopolitical risk in this market. You're going to hear it within this podcast, but just so much. I mean, Ukraine hit a Russian port in the last couple of days. They brought that back online. But I mean, the fact that you see a dollar move on that and not 5 or 10 is just kind of amazing. So we have no geopolitical risk premium in this market. I think there's absolutely risk to the upside for oil. Doesn't mean we're not well supplied, just means the geopolitical risk is not in this, not being priced into oil at all. There's an incredible downside and negative sentiment pressure on oil right now. Henry Hub, really, really important, and something I want to spend a little time talking about in this intro today is that Henry Hub is at $4 and $4.36. Now it was well over 450 last week, and in the past couple of weeks we've seen north of 450. Really, really big deal given that 2024 we were at $2 an MCF on average. In 2020, so that was on average. And then earlier this year, we've basically been seeing $3 an MCF, and that has been enough to give price signals to the market. Now, lots of folks were expecting higher prices like we're seeing now, but that was enough to give price signals to the market to tell people to drill. And so we have seen rigs for oil and natural gas actually tick up. We've seen frac fleet stabilize, and we're seeing the signal on nat gas. Now, the reason for the nat gas pricing is really driven on not on demand domestically, not on weather necessarily. It's really driven on LNG exports, which we're going to talk about shortly. So Dutch TTF, we're not seeing big moves there. We're seeing, $10.70. So not super high, not super low. It's been pretty range bound in the area. And then also very, very importantly, right now, we're looking at the 10-year yield at 4.139%. Now, that is notched up higher. So, it wasn't that long ago that we were seeing the 10-year yield flirt in the threes and hang around this 4, and it's notched up. Lots of different reasons for that. But with that, the 30-year mortgage rate has went up. So we're looking at 30-year mortgage rate at 6.35% on average right now for today, I believe. But so when you see the 10-year-old tick up, that's usually driven by a few things. That's either fear of the debt, that's fear of, if we're going to have increased spending and we have debt fears, or if we don't have folks buying treasuries because we have that, or it's there's a number of different factors. It usually goes down or it can go down when everybody else is doing poorly and then people are buying into treasuries. But right now, when we're seeing that go up, that could be a bet that we are going to see the Fed lower interest rates and therefore we're going to have higher inflation. And so the 10-year-old pops up. Not super clear what it is. I've been traveling since November 5th, so I haven't watched the 10-year-old super closely, but we have popped up. Part of that is we're getting a lot of government data that's coming in this week. So this Thursday, in just a few days, we are going to have the September jobs report. So we're going to have this delayed data. Now, a lot of folks are talking about the fact that this data is going to come in better than expected, even though you're having Fed officials say the downside risk is on labor. It's very, very mixed. You're clearly seeing a lot of non-agreement within the Fed of folks on the labor side, folks on the inflation side. Very, very unclear. You did just have a Fed governor who also the one that quit or left earlier and resigned, and she basically left the post. It was Kugler who left the post for the new guy, Marion, who is Trump's appointee. She resigned, and it came out today that she actually resigned because she had done some unethical trades. They have very strict trading requirements where they have windows in which they can trade. She did the trade, and this is kind of disgusting because this is what Robert Kaplan did as well, and he also resigned. You're on the Fed. You shouldn't be allowed to trade, period. The fact that Chris Wright has to sell off everything, absolutely everything, so there can be no conflict of interest in his assets, and he's the Secretary of Energy. Why would we allow Fed officials to trade at all? They should have to put their stuff in a fund or something, and somebody else does it. But anyway, she traded, and she tried to get a reprieve or something for that. It was not granted by Powell, and so it just kind of adds to this pressure. But there's actually been quite a bit of that if you've been following this closely. Okay, so you're going to have all this data come out, and so we're done with the government shutdown. But we were just recently. I mean, we just ended this government shutdown last week, and essentially that was on Friday. We ended this, so people were probably starting to get paid on Friday. It's legally mandated once they stop the government shutdown, you're paid usually within 24 hours. So most people were getting paid. There was a lot of messiness in Houston. So I did not see air traffic control issues. I'm certain that happened. Definitely, I've heard it on the East Coast. Actually, ironically, knocking on wood, all of my flights went on time, and I think that's partly because they had reduced traffic, and so we didn't have that problem. But you never have flights on time with United flying in and out of Denver or in and out of Houston. And so, interestingly enough, all of my flights in and out of Denver, going to Oklahoma City, then going to Houston, all on time. But there was a lot of hell in Houston, and that was because they got rid of TSA pre in a terminal. Then you had to walk around, and the people in Terminal C are really, really grumpy. And they were getting paid that day, so I don't really think they have too much reason to be super grumpy. But there was also construction, and it was crazy, and so it did create a lot of backlog of people having to come super early and not knowing where to go. And if you went to Terminal C, they didn't direct you to go anywhere; they were just mute, which was ridiculous. But anyways, so we ended the government shutdown after 43 days. We're getting jobs data this week, and so all of this is going to impact whether or not we're going to have a rate cut or we're going to have a pause. And there's a pretty mixed bag of sentiment on that, and that's what's giving you this kind of yield volatility. Now, so I've been traveling from when I left Denver on November 5th. I spoke with the Denver Earth Resources Library. I hosted a panel. I'm on the board. It was awesome. It went really, really well, at least the part I attended. So we kicked off a panel at noon. I had my former boss, Joe DeDominic, who's the president of Anschutz Exploration. That was super. It was awesome. So he talked a lot about the Powder River Basin. I got him to talk a little about the Uinta in Utah as well. I had Tad True, who's a friend, colleague, and been a client over the years, and was on boards of nonprofits that I was with in the past. And so Tad True with True Companies and Bridger Pipeline, he joined us as well to talk about the midstream side of the Powder. We also talked about the Uinta. Very, very interesting given the rail side. And then I had Nathan Anderson, who's with the North Dakota Department of Mineral Resources, who is also a client of mine. And he also joined us to talk about North Dakota and the Williston Basin. it's a really phenomenal panel. I was really impressed with the turnout at the Denver Three Resources Library. So much thanks to Amanda Cohn for putting this on, but it was awesome. And I even had people come up to me at the library and say, I'm here because I heard it on your podcast. So really cool. Thank you guys so much for listening. Thank you guys for attending. It is going to be a hell of a podcast because I did record this. So started there, and then I jumped on a flight and went to London, and then I spoke at the Oxford Institute for Studies Oil Day. Now, really interesting because I didn't speak last year, and clearly there were a lot of questions on U.S. shale, and that is what I spoke about. So U.S. shale, U.S. production, 13.8 million barrels a day. I'm not going to give you too much. I'm not going to give you too much intel on this because I'll be talking about this in forthcoming podcasts. But I will just summarize by this saying, they were surprised by this. Everyone was surprised by this. And I think it really interesting in all my meetings in London and Oxford that everyone was surprised that the US was producing 13.8 million barrels per day. Now, to be fair, there are a lot of folks in the oil and gas industry that are wrapping their arms around with how we got to this figure as well. But I think it's a little bit different. And that's because what I kept hearing from folks was that we had already peaked. And so it's really interesting when you hear that a lot. I literally just heard Jason Bordoff with Columbia for the Center for Strategic Studies, Center for Energy Studies on Center for Strategic International Studies from Columbia. I just heard him on CNBC last night, and he was talking about peak shale as well. And so when you're pumping this peak shale narrative, it's easy for entities and the IEA, others, global entities to get comfortable that we've already peaked. And I think that's really, it's not real, right? So we have to be careful with that. And so if you're already thinking we peaked, I think we've had some dislocations in the market. So that was really interesting. I gave an absolute deep dive. I did record that. It was Chatham House Rules, but I recorded mine. So that will be an awesome, awesome podcast. I'm really excited for that. So that is recorded and that will be forthcoming, and a total rip on US shale and Q&A as well. So that was great. And then I went to London and I had some meetings, and I met with some folks from Ministry of Defense, and I talked about China and US shale and everything happening. So interesting stuff there. I think it kept getting this focus back of, I always say this when I go abroad, but I say this particularly, the further you get out from the shale patch, the less you understand it. And so I think it's really important to realize that, if you're looking to London or New York or these financial hubs and you're thinking that they're going to understand what's going on in the field, they don't. And right, so they're not going to understand, why we're at 13.8 million barrels per day. And so that's really important for a global oil market that's not really well covered. That I always say this, but traditional fuels, oil, natural gas, coal are not well appreciated by the stock market or the market more broadly, and certainly not appreciated in how they fit into the market in the now, in the medium term, and in the long term. And that's just super important because, in the discussions that we had at this meeting on China, which I'll get into again in future podcasts, but in the discussions we had on China and the discussions we had on OPEC, the discussions we had on spare capacity or not spare capacity or how much China's stockpiling, there did not seem to be a harnessing of reality of the long-term nature of fuels and demand and what was really happening in China. Nor did anyone talk about the elephant in the room, which is that China is 92 exajoules of the 165 total exajoules consumed. So massive coal consumption on the China front. And that is really just not appreciated when we're talking about natural gas, when we're talking about oil, when we're talking about trajectory. And that's important because in this, if you were listening to CNBC late last night, I mean, this is unbelievable because there was a Financial Times article that dropped last week that talked about China decarbonizing its manufacturing base, which is laughable and not true. Their manufacturing base is built on this rock behind me. It's built on coal because you need processing, like you need a lot of energy. They don't have natural gas. They don't have the same oil that we do. So they're going to use coal, and they're not going to do that with wind and solar. You just don't have heavy industry built on wind and solar. China does have wind and solar. That is to back up, that's to create energy, that's to create more energy security. But importantly, in this talk on CNBC, where you had the announcer, he actually says, the interviewer to Jason Bordoff, he says, I think it's fair to say that China is the global powerhouse on green energy. And that is, now they're building it. They're building a lot of wind turbines. They're building a lot of solar panels. They're exporting a lot of that. And they do have a lot in their grid, but it's a fraction of what they have for coal. So they are not a green power. They're not a green powerhouse in the way you think that they're going green. They're not going green. They're just using the green to offset some coal, which means you should actually be more worried about them from an energy security standpoint because that is how they're using it. So it really is a misunderstanding of this. And I also heard Jason Bordoff, again, as I mentioned, talk about peak shale. And so I just think there's a lot of disconnects and lack of reality here. And so he was trying to pacify everyone and make everyone happy a little bit on the oil side, and also talk about climate and that we need to deal with climate. And you just cannot have your cake and eat it too, because China is a coal power. They're consuming more than half of the world's global coal consumption, and their CO2 emissions are up and to the right and ours are down. That's how it is. And coal is so important from an energy security standpoint and a stabilization factor, especially when we talk about the $4.36 for natural gas prices. Now, I think this is a really big deal. So $4.36 for natural gas prices. We saw this 450. I am concerned that the oil and gas industry is going to get blamed for rising electricity prices. Now, I've talked about this at length. I talked about it in this keynote, which you'll hear about it. But these rising electricity prices, this push from AI demand and from just overall the fact that we haven't built out power demand, we're putting some pressure to increase electricity costs. But the electricity costs have been rising because we've added so much wind and solar into the grid and decommissioned that coal. And it's so tight now that it's a one-to-one correlation where when you add the wind and solar into the grid, you decommission the coal, electricity prices go up. When you stop adding that wind and solar and you stop decommissioning coal, electricity prices actually flatline. And you can see this directly in the monthly net generation data out of the EIA. So when we saw this 450 price spike, now the reason is because, you've probably seen Toby Rice on TV talking about this 19 BCF a day. It's actually 21.5 BCF a day on average that we have been exporting in the 6 days between November 6th and November 12th. That is what's driven this price spike. So it's not weather, and we're actually looking at storage levels in the U.S. up massively. So it tells you that whether your storage levels go down in the U.S., when you look on EIA, you can see it clearly. The storage levels go down. That usually correlates with price. Not in this case because we've had these exports. Storage levels go down when weather gets colder, and so we've had some cold snaps, but not massively. I mean, it was particularly warm when I was in London and Oxford last week. So and the week before. So that we had 34 vessels that totaled an 129 billion cubic feet of that left the U.S. between November 6th and November 12th. So on average, that is 21.5 BCF a day. That is 6.5 BCF a day more than your average in August, your latest monthly average that you see of 15 BCF a day, which is what we were hanging around this $3 an MCF. So massive, massive uptick. So does that LNG export growth? That is a really good thing. I think this is great. We need some support on natural gas. However, we need to not be decommissioning coal. We need to not be penalizing coal. We need to be keeping it in the grid, and we need to be using it to shave off those price spikes. And we need to be talking to consumers about why their electricity bills are going up. It is not because coal. It is not because of natural gas. It is because of wind and solar. It is because of the decommissioning of natural gas, and it is because your utility companies are rate hiking and for natural gas in particular, and not passing those benefits on to you. So massive, massive issues going on there. So I think that's a warning flag. I think the industry needs to be cognizant of that. Okay, so oil prices at $59 a barrel. And we talked about these reasons. We have a lot of supply. I think the market is still overweighing the sentiment, this negative sentiment. That was largely because the IEA came out with a report that actually last week and talked about, they talked about, yes, we have okay demand, but we have a lot of supply, and they reiterated that supply gap in the first half of next year. So, if we get sanctions implemented, which would be November 21st, that you have sanctions that go into effect for Rosneft and Lukoil, that would be a lot of crude oil. That would be like half the crude oil that's being exported from Russia comes from Rosneft and Lukoil. So it would be a decent amount of production that you were impacting. Now, if Rosneft and Lukoil are able to sell their assets, their other assets abroad, that could change things a little bit. And so it wouldn't be as severely impacted. So it all depends on how the proof is in the pudding and in the details of how this gets enforced. Now, I believe Trump said last night or over the weekend that he basically said he would support a bill from Congress that went for more aggressive sanctions on Russia, which would include Iran and Venezuelan crude. So with all that being said, it seems like the administration is very much open to more aggressive sanctions. But when you're looking at the actual data, Iran is producing over 4 million barrels a day. China's taking over 2.5 million barrels a day of that. You're looking at Iraq producing over 4 million barrels a day. So you have a lot of production. Importantly, the crude that is on the water is a lot of sanctioned crude. So you have a lot of crude that's coming from Latin America, which takes a long time to move around. So you just inadvertently by location, by the fact that we're producing and exporting crude out of the U.S. and out of Latin America, if you're shipping it to Europe or you're shipping it to Asia, it's going to take longer to get there. So therefore, you have more crude on the water just because of distance and where it's coming from. And then you have a lot of crude on the water that's kind of in limbo land where folks don't know what to do with it. A lot of it's purchased already, but a lot of it is sanctioned crude that's sort of sitting there. So I think we have to be very careful about this massive amped up rhetoric of crude oil on the water because we're not seeing the same stuff on land. We're not seeing the same stuff from demand. So that's my pin in that. I still think oil prices are very oversold. And lastly, I just want to talk about Japan and China. If you've missed this, I was traveling. So after I was in London and Oxford, I went to Oklahoma, I flew into Denver, then straight to Oklahoma City last week and went to the Oklahoma Petroleum Alliance of Oklahoma. I spoke there in the morning. It was fantastic. What a great crowd. I crammed in a lot of intel into 25 minutes. So that will also drop as a podcast. Really, really good questions from the audience. have to give a huge thank you for Petroleum Alliance of Oklahoma for having me. I love coming to Oklahoma City, love the people, love the environment, and just love the regulatory environment. So I'm really bullish on what Oklahoma could do for production, especially for nat gas and with these prices. But anyways, from there, came back to, went to an event in Houston, and then came back to Denver on Friday. And so last week I missed, because I was doing all this traveling, what happened with Japan and China. So if you missed that as well, because so much is going on in the news, it was that there are some frosty relationships because Japan has a new female prime minister, Takeshita, if I'm saying that right. I apologize if I'm botching that name. So she's a Shinzo Abe alum. She basically is a student of Shinzo Abe. So she kind of believes in she's more conservative. She's definitely more hawkish on China, which I like, just because she's clear-eyed about this. But it means she's talking about China. And that's something a lot of Japanese prime ministers have not wanted to do. They really haven't wanted to dance around the issue. And the response has been pretty impressive because, and I say impressive because of over Taiwan, she just made a comment and there's been basically a huge response from China, really upset, saying they're not going to approve visas. They're not recommending people go to Japan. Huge response. And this is interesting given all that you're going to hear in this talk, this keynote about China playing the rarest cards and everything. But what happened essentially is that the Japanese prime minister made a comment on Japan's involvement or what would happen if China went after Taiwan. And she said it would be, quote, a survival threatening situation. That's what the quote that I've read, survival threatening situation. And China was really upset about this. And that's mainly because, like I've said, Japan has been kind of mute on it, right? That they haven't just been articulate. They've clearly, we're working with Japan. They're clearly an ally of ours. They're clearly quite nervous if there was something to happen with Taiwan, and they would likely get involved militarily. So China's response was this would, quote, be an act of aggression. That is hilarious and adorable that that's an act of aggression because China is penalizing Japan now for saying that this would be a threatening situation when, and they're saying this would be an act of aggression against China because China says that Taiwan is theirs. But China has made it very clear that they will not rule out force or to take over Taiwan. So basically the things that everyone's thinking are just being said, and you can clearly see China's reaction. So with that, that's the introduction for this podcast. Now, this podcast was recorded October 16th in Dallas. This is Whitley Penn. This is with my colleague on stage. The moderator is Buffie Campbell with Whitley Penn. It's a really good conversation. She asks a lot of great questions, and we talk about everything from oil prices, geopolitics, Russia, China, OPEC Plus, the state of the economy, drill baby drill, the policies of the administration, artificial intelligence, natural gas, electricity prices, a lot on electricity prices, and we follow up with some great questions from the audience. So with that, folks, thank you guys so much for listening. Really appreciate it. I am definitely deep in the weeds and underwater on some projects right now. So working deep on China right now, but I will work on getting you some short intros recapped for we have a lot of podcasts in the queue. I recorded the Denver Earth Resources Library one. I recorded the one in Oxford. I also recorded the talk I did in Oklahoma, and I still have the Houston Producers Forum. There's just a lot that's been out there. So you're going to have a lot of great podcasts in the queue. I'll try to keep these intros short and sweet. So thank you guys so much for listening. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Our keynote speaker today is going to be Trisha Curtis. She's the president and CEO of PetroNerds. This is where she leads research and consulting focused on U.S. shale markets, geopolitics, and energy economics. She has advised government agencies, think tanks, and corporations, and is a recognized speaker at global forums including OPEC, Stanford, and Oxford. Trisha previously held roles at EPRINC and Anschutz Exploration and has authored numerous reports on upstream and midstream energy markets. She also hosts a podcast called PetroNerds and holds fellowships with several energy-focused institutions. So thank you for being here today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So we're going to have some hard-hitting questions, and I'm going to let you just kind of take it from there.
Yep.
So we'll start with the big elephant in the room when it comes to oil and gas, and that's oil prices. So we hit record production numbers in the U.S. It's around like 13.5 billion barrels a day, I believe.
Yep.
Million barrels a day. There we go. WTI is trading at $57.50, give or take. At a conference earlier this year, Diamondback's CEO said that production will stall at $60 oil. He actually quoted, "There's only so much tier one rock. On an inflation-adjusted basis, $60 oil today is equivalent to $45 oil 6 or 7 years ago. And at $50 oil, I think that's an even harder story." Conoco's CEO made some pretty similar statements at the Energy Intelligence Forum in London earlier this week. He said that prices stay at $60 or go into the 50s, you probably are plateauing production or slightly declining it. So why are oil prices continuing to stay low?
Yeah, so there's a lot there. And a lot of ground to cover. So I think this is a perfect follow-on from the AI talk, because we'll get into that a little bit too. But so yeah, we're at $57 oil today. Not good. It's a really negative outlook. I think it's actually really it's really sexy right now to be super negative on oil. But actually it's been really sexy to be negative on oil for years, because that's where the market coverage has been. But now everyone's got a negative oil trade, and they're telling you why. There's every excuse in the book for why oil prices are low, and that's that 6 months ago, it was that we're going to go into recession. It was that, and then when Trump met with Putin, it was that they met and we're going to have a peace deal. Now we don't have a peace deal there, but we have a peace deal with Hamas. Well, I mean, you name the excuse, this is what's driving oil prices lower. Now people are talking about inventories, and we certainly have a lot of crude oil on the market. So the U.S. is at record oil production. Every month we break a new record, and I think the market's been very, very surprised. Even folks in this room probably are quite surprised as a 13.64 million barrels per day that the U.S. is producing as of July. Most people did not think we could be there given all the negative sentiment, and this is where I think negative sentiment gets you in trouble, is that we had so much negative sentiment, but that's not exactly what happened in the field, because when the drill bit goes into the ground and it's relatively productive, we get the 13.64 million barrels per day. So we have a lot of oil on the market. That's very true. We have very, very unique things happening in the market. I mean, I'm just reading through the headlines today, and you're seeing super negativity on banks, on what's going on with the auto side. That's been brewing for a while. I always remind folks that economic crises take years to foment, and they take weeks or days to implode. So that's what we're kind of seeing on that front. It's not something that's going to crater the economy, but if you think that talk to everyone who has an Escalade or an F-150 and find out what their credit score is. In the past 10 years, it hasn't been very good, and they're overstretched. So there's all these real things in the global economy that are sort of weighing on prices. But first and foremost, we have a lot of supply. We have a lot of supply in the U.S., and we have a very poor understanding of the market. I mean, fundamentally and truly, most people in the oil and gas industry don't know all the factors, and that's okay, because there's a lot going on. But there's a lot of things happening geopolitically that are driving prices, and things are not matching up right now. And I always caveat this and say, I'm not an oil bull. I am not the person that's going to get on stage and tell you we are going to 85, we're going to stay there forever, and this is the next cycle, and we're going to ride it, and I'm not a perma bull, because we have so much supply and we're so good at it that it ends up bringing prices back down. However, I will say we should not be at $57 oil today. We're absolutely oversold. And so yes, we have a lot of global supply in the market. Yes, we have inventory on the water, but we have enough geopolitical risk that we should at least be at 65. And we also have enough, the fundamental factors haven't changed. You all didn't stop driving today. The traffic was pretty bad in Dallas today, or decent in Dallas. It was pretty bad in Denver this morning at 5:30 a.m. when I was in an Uber on the way to the airport. So no one stopped driving. These haven't shifted. I will say that the China market, which I spend a lot of time looking at on a national security side and on the energy side, it's very, very opaque. And it's something to think about. How well do you understand China? The market, you probably hear about the stock market, you probably hear about, on the AI stuff, you hear about DeepSeek, but the coverage we have a deep, liquid, transparent market from oil to treasuries. We know the US because we have the data. We don't right now because we're in the 15th day of a government shutdown, but typically we have it. You have nothing like that, absolutely nothing in China. And China is the second largest oil consumer in the world. So when you don't have that color and that data, you create a big box that's just big question mark. And I think right now, a lot of stuff is happening in the big question mark box, including a war economy that's on a war footing, that's helping Russia, that's probably prepping for their own stuff, and that's just an absolute kind of mess in terms of what's going on. And they're a very coal-driven economy. They consume a lot of oil, but they actually use a lot of electricity, and they're very coal-driven. So there's a lot of question marks there. So we have a bunch of geopolitical things happening. The war in Ukraine, it has not ended. Okay, so even if Trump is going to meet with Putin, I think this just came out just within the past couple hours that he had a long phone call with him, and he's going to meet with him in Budapest. And so then that's the next excuse to sell off oil. But that wasn't the excuse this morning, right? That excuse didn't exist, and we were still selling off of oil. So everything is just this reinforcing this negative sentiment. So it's oil on the water. It's the U.S. is exporting a lot of oil. It's Trump is meeting with Putin. It's we got a ceasefire in Gaza. But you also have, up until today, you have the stock market ripping higher, and you've got gold at $4,500 or looking toward $4,500 now. So you got a lot of weird, wonky things at play. And so even if the stock market's going up and the economy is doing well, you still have oil selling off. And so I think the negative sentiment, the sell side button, algorithmic trading, but importantly, traders, physical traders, young men in New York, I think particularly, don't fundamentally understand the market, and they're negative and they don't feel good, and they click the sell button, and that's what you're seeing. And I say that because I think the human role in trading for oil is a really, really big deal. And what happened during COVID was a lot of people pull out of oil, a lot of folks, a lot of banks, a lot of entities, and so now you have limited and thinner trading volumes, and so you can move the market. So whenever somebody tells me that, hey, we're going to X price soon, we can move $5 today. It means nothing. It means nothing on the fundamentals. So I think you have to be very, very careful with that. But you have to ask yourself, and I don't, when I work with clients, I don't say, this is where we're going in 2 weeks, because that's just not a serious conversation. But I can say, where today at 57 should we be here? And why are we at 57 today? And we can get very, very comfortable with that. Once you get comfortable with that, it's much easier to make business decisions. So no, we should not be at 57. The world has not collapsed. Yes, we do have a lot of supply in the market, and we have plenty of geopolitical risk as well. And we have one of the most unique geopolitical risk markets out there. And then I would just say, I think we talked about negative sentiment, the downside excuses. Peak shale, and maybe talking about, it's very interesting, these comments from Diamondback and from Continental as well, because actually those are pretty muted. I mean, I'm going to get a call from the Diamondback CEO at some point, because I like to talk about him a lot. Because, they like to get out there and they like to tell the market what they think, and they like to move the market. Well, I think that's even they've cooled off their rhetoric a little bit on this kind of peak shaling, because we heard this in March at CERA Week, where we heard Continental and Oxy and everyone saying we're hitting peak shale. And I just want to remind everyone, we're at $57 oil today, but the average price of WTI this year, and I bet you wouldn't guess, it's $67 a barrel this year. The sentiment does not reflect 67. 67 is an okay oil price. It is not amazing, but it's not 40, and it's not 57. So the sentiment is not reflecting that. But Diamondback CEO, Continental, all this peak shale talking, the recent rhetoric that he's saying is that we're going to plateau at 60. Well, no crap. We will probably plateau production at $60 a barrel. It doesn't take a rocket science to figure that out. But you're plateauing. That's a different word than peaking. And I've talked about this in previous Whitley Penn events, and I've dropped this on podcasts. It's not peak shale. It's probably plateau shale or butte shale. And that does not mean it has peaked. It means that at a certain price point, we will start leveling off. I don't buy the tier. I understand that some rock is better than others. I know we're cored up. I know they have a lot of acreage. But that doesn't mean that if you go to $75 oil, that more is not going to be at play. And so you have seen the CEO of Diamondback and Diamondback tone down the rhetoric a little bit, because they were proven incorrect. In May, when they said everyone was pulling back, that's not actually what happened, and we've seen production actually go up. So $60 a barrel, absolutely. We will start seeing production pull back. We're going to start seeing some things pull back. But the rig count, if you guys have watched it, it pulled back significantly, and then it came back, and then it kind of plateaued, and it's kind of hanging around there. And same thing with the frac fleet count. But super, super importantly is the rig count does not need to be nearly as high as it was. And that is because we are drilling 4-mile long laterals on a regular. And so not every well is 4 miles long, but on the whole, our average lateral length has ticked up, and we're well over 11,000 feet on average for every single horizontal lateral. And so our rig count just doesn't need to be that high. And at the same time, the frac fleets, the horsepower is nearly twice what it was 5 years ago. So the horsepower there is just really, really significant. And so we are getting more out of the rock, and we're getting more out of the crappy rock. And so if I take crappier rock and I put more sand in it and I put more fluid in it, I get pretty good production out of it. And I see that in the actual production data at the 13.64 million barrels per day, and I see that on the level of whether I look at the company or whether I look at the basin and I look at their productivity curves and the decline rate. That's what I see as well, is that it's not smashed. And so it's really, really interesting is that the industry keeps getting disproven. And they know this as an individual company because they see the data and they see it in front of them and they know how well they're doing, but they have a hard time extrapolating that forward and saying, well, hey, the rest of the industry is probably doing this well too. And that is a trend I've seen for my entire career of studying this business.
Wow, okay. You actually hit on some of my other questions as well. So I know I do want to hit on the administration as well, the current Trump administration, because he actually campaigned on drill baby drill, right? So I know you're talking about 3 and 4 mile laterals, and I've even seen talking about horsepower that can get us to 6 mile laterals kind of in the works. Where does that take us over the next, you mentioned 2 weeks, but like where does that take us over the next couple of months? Where are we sitting production-wise? Where are we going to be sitting price-wise? The EIA came out with some pricing that went all the way down to like $52 a barrel, right? But then it also was like $100 at the max if there was like a span there. So like where do you actually see it going if you were to do a forecast and look forward?
Well, it's easy to be right when you've got a span between $52 and $100 as the EIA has. So I think the EIA has been they've kind of been wrong with a lot of things. If you looked at their outlook at the end of last year, they've been very low on oil production. I think they had us, lots of folks I talked to late last year had the U.S. not hitting 14 million barrels per day until like 2027, including the EIA. So everyone was really shy and below forecast, right? And so we kept eking out more production. And so a lot of that has to do, it's incremental gains. And I can't underline that enough. It's not one little thing. It's incremental gains across the board. And I say this because when I talk to clients or I talk to folks in the field or I go into the field, and if there's an opportunity, I always put my hands up, like boots on the ground. Like when I go into the field and I talk to operators, every time I talk to them, it's not we shortened our days to drill that well by 10 days. It's every time we've shortened it a little bit more here, a little bit more here. And so all these incremental gains from drilling faster, drilling longer, completing a little bit better, staying in zone, all these are incrementally adding up. And so the incremental moves are pretty significant. Now on pricing, where we're going to go, I'm not going to say predicting pricing. We should not be at 57 today. They're easily at an average of 67, and I've told folks this entire year, you will continue to have moments where you flirt back up to 70. So for every person, actually you can't find that many bulls out there. And I say bull as somebody who thinks we should be at 70. So count me as a bull. But you can't find that many out there, but there's plenty of intelligent people that would tell you we should probably be at $70 a barrel, just because for supply and demand fundamentals and geopolitical risk. But we've had all these opportunities over the course of the year where we flirted back up to 70. And so there were opportunities to hedge. And so what you've seen is I think you have seen operators actually hedging there. And so if you're hedged, and you're working through this, you're making the math work. And then kind of like OPEC producers, you might just drill through it, right? You might try to offset some of the losses by producing a little bit more. And folks do this. And then that starts stacking up with production. But to your question of, where are we going for prices? And if the EIA is saying, they're 52 for Brent seems aggressively low. Could we go there? Absolutely, but that would call for a recession. So if we have $52 Brent, that means we're in recession. We're at $61 right now. And so I do think that's the other big disconnect that the stock market and the economy is having is that if oil prices are this low, we either have a massive, way too much production, not just 1 million barrels a day extra, but we have something going on with the consumer that's really, really slowing down. And so that can happen, and we do have a lot of deterioration in the market and the potentially in the consumer, but we're not there yet, right? People have to start losing jobs for that to happen. And even then, when you lose your job, you drive less, but you don't stop driving entirely because you're looking for another job. So I think the EIA is off there. But the drill baby drill, this has been the biggest question I got for the first 6 months of this year was, well, what do you mean drill baby drill? Like this administration wants lower oil prices. And so, and I think you put this in your notes too, and we saw this in the Fed Dallas survey commentary. It's very negative. If you guys read that commentary, it's extremely negative. And I have clients call me up and say, man, people are telling me about $40 oil, and which is look, there's no reason. We're not going to $40 oil. If we go there, we're going to stay there for about 2 minutes and it's going to pop back up. So that is just complete fear. That's not knowledge. That's just sentiment. And that's incorrect sentiment that is not based on reality or market intelligence, which those people need to be having so they can make better decisions. But that negative sentiment, I've heard that from the beginning of this year, of that this president isn't, he wants low oil prices. And firstly, let's just point out why the president wanted low oil prices. And he does want drill, baby, drill. And let's be honest, we have drill, baby, drilled because we're at 13.64 million barrels per day. So like it or lump it, you did what the president wanted you to do. So we have lower prices that helps the consumer and that helps gasoline prices. It has been doing the heavy lifting for inflation. So if you actually chart inflation and you chart unemployment, chart oil prices have come down. It's helped inflation a little bit, headline inflation. But the problem is there's a bunch of sectors in the economy that need to lower inflation too. The thing is that oil prices is the only thing that goes up and down. Almost everything else, nothing goes back down. Maybe egg prices when you have something and then egg prices come back down. But oil prices are the only thing where they go up and you feel that at the pump. And when they go down, you also feel that at the pump. And so it's very easy to say, you feel okay when you see lower oil prices. Now, if everything else is ripping and it's really high and you have high oil prices, you start feeling yucky. So that was an easy lever for the president to say, we want that. What he needs to be doing is going after electricity prices. And I'm dead serious about this. You have got to focus on electricity prices because they are skyrocketing. So they are talking about energy prices more broadly. And I think, I know Chris Wright and others within the administration understand that oil prices, and Chris Wright has even talked about this a little bit. You are seeing the Trump administration dial back the 50 rhetoric a little bit, and there was a lot of negativity of like, oh, we don't want him saying 50 and they want $50 oil. They shouldn't want $50 oil. Honestly, we're the largest producer in the entire world for oil production. He should really want $75 oil. I mean, $75 oil would be great for the industry. It's okay for the consumer, and it would be huge benefits to this economy. But they just aren't okay with that right now. Really, what they need to be doing is making sure that the $2.94 an MCF natural gas Henry Hub prices that you're getting today, that needs to be passed along to the consumer. And right now, in no way, shape, or form is that passed along to the consumer. So there's where the big disconnect is that natural gas prices, and this is really huge because when we talk about AI, I'm sure you guys were all thinking this, and maybe he mentioned it when I was using the restroom, but the amount of energy that it uses is huge. And so what's happened with AI is everyone's building the stack and everybody's buying the GPUs and everyone's building everything, but they have not built out the infrastructure and energy. And typically, that's what kind of people focus on. When you build a pipeline of something, you have to build the pipelines, right? Yeah, we can drill a well, but if we don't have the pipelines built, we can't get that oil to market. So we have a big problem on the energy space with artificial intelligence and electricity prices. But this drill, baby, drill, yes, the president wants everyone to drill and he wants higher oil production, which we have. To keep benefiting the consumer, you need lower electricity prices. And so that natural gas price needs to be passed along to the consumer. Currently, it's not. Right now, the utility companies are charging over $20 an MCF for natural gas prices. That's what you're paying as a residential consumer. So that's called highway robbery, and the utility companies are packing up a lot of that, and they're using a lot of it to fund their renewable programs and pay for a lot of infrastructure. So we need to pass that savings along to the consumer. And then we have to realize that, who's going to get the blame for rising electricity prices? It's going to be natural gas, because natural gas is half of the electricity pool, roughly, for net generation right now in the US. But importantly, we've had coal come down, and right now we actually have more wind and solar power generation than we have coal. That is the reason electricity prices are up. Full stop, bar none. That's it, right? You have a little bit of fluctuations in pricing with nat gas and utilities companies screwing you there, but it's really about wind and solar. They're intermittent, they're unreliable, they're extremely expensive. There's nowhere in this world, except for China, when you put wind and solar into the grid, that electricity prices don't go up. That's just what happens. And so when you take coal and that cheap baseload power out, that goes up. So that's a huge issue. So when everybody wants to talk about drill, baby, drill, I move them back to sort of nat gas and electricity prices. But really on nat gas, the other thing you're seeing, you're probably seeing articles from Wall Street Journal and others that are saying we're going to have either an LNG glut or we are not going to have enough nat gas, because we're not going to be able to power everything that we need for this nat gas demand. Two, they're both quite incorrect, right? The only way you would have an LNG glut is if you don't have the infrastructure to move it to market. The global demand is there, but that's true, right? We need the ships, we have to have the market, and we can talk about a little more about the geopolitics and who needs it. But when it comes to the front end of can we produce it, I think the Wall Street Journal alluded just the other day that we couldn't produce enough, and that is not true. The second largest producer is Russia, and they produce 61 BCF a day as of 2024. We produce over 130 billion cubic feet per day gross withdrawals every single day right now. So more than double the next largest producer. We do not have a problem with natural gas supply. We have a problem with getting into the grid and the consumers actually getting the price that they should be paying for it.
Okay, so I'm going to segue on that a little bit, go back to the renewables, the wind, the solar for just a second. So we've seen a lot of kind of solar permits being taken away by this administration. Is that going to help?
So I think that's a starting point. We've certainly seen it with the shutdown, where you saw Colorado lost $500 million, but every state that had a lot of it, the Department of Energy has taken this moment to say, okay, we're just taking away your grant. Part of it was also because during the Biden administration, the last 76 days, so when Trump was elected to when he came into office, during that period, 76 days, I think $94 billion was given out by the Department of Energy, record amounts to companies that didn't even have a business plan and didn't have anything behind it, mostly to renewables. And so they're clawing some of that back. But right now they're just taking away a lot of grants because they can. So it is helping. But what I've said right now that we already have more wind and solar in the producing power than we have coal. That's what's giving you high electricity prices. So that is a problem. We're just exacerbating it if you're adding AI and you're adding all this power generation demand and you're adding renewables, you are going to have an exponential rise in electricity prices. And super important to put in context because we have not had inflation in electricity prices. We didn't have it for a decade. They were flat. It was about 13 cents a kilowatt hour. Now on average, we're about 20 cents a kilowatt hour. On the East Coast and West Coast, you're seeing prices as high as 40 to 50 cents a kilowatt hour. That's really, really important because you know where you also see 45 cents a kilowatt hour? Germany. You know where you can't produce anything? Germany. Do you know how expensive it is in the province of Xinjiang in China? It's about 3 cents a kilowatt hour. So you want to talk about competing with your biggest adversary and your strategic competitor? It's in electricity. And you cannot compete with China at 20 cents a kilowatt hour versus 3 cents a kilowatt hour.
Okay, we're going to go back and talk about OPEC a little bit. Yep. And so OPEC made an announcement that they would increase October production by 137,000 barrels. And then there was another report that they were going to increase a second time 500,000 barrels in November. OPEC came back later and said, hey, none of this is accurate. It's all false reporting. We never said any of this. So, but it affected the market considerably. So announcements come out versus reality. Where do we stand on that? And where's OPEC kind of hitting in reality right now?
Yeah, so they are, and good to retreat back, and because I digressed a little bit on electricity prices. Okay, so OPEC and geopolitics, it's super geopolitical. Most of these OPEC increases, and I'll be honest, if I was advising Saudi Arabia a year ago, I would have said, bring barrels back to the market. The market, it's not horrible. You need to take back market share, and I don't work for them. But if somebody was advising them, a smart advisor probably would have done that, right? So that's what they did, right? Saudi Arabia is literally just taking back market share. So they gave the market a couple of years ago, they gave this big lollipop cut of 1 million barrels per day. It was a voluntary cut. And so what that did was it gave OPEC Plus a sense of kind of false cohesion. And it really did put stability into the market because it put a floor on prices and it helped support oil prices. Now Saudi Arabia has seen their market share eroded by Russia, by U.S. shale. We can put a pin in do they understand U.S. shale or not, but also by Iraq and by Iran. And so if I'm Saudi Arabia, what they like to do is they like to just do these things through OPEC and pretend that they're not actually going against Iraq, Iran, or Russia. But that's really what this is about. So if you've actually followed every single OPEC Plus output increase, and the one that you probably remember was followed April 2nd, Liberation Day, where the stock market, everyone lost their minds with the tariffs. And then I'm not saying the tariffs, we lost our minds with tariffs, I'm saying people lost their mind because of tariffs. Then on April 3rd, you had the OPEC Plus announcement. Not maybe the best timing because that really tanked the market, but people were already spooked before. So when I was talking with folks in Houston, I'm talking to oil operators and everyone, people were already anxious and negative about oil prices a month before this ever happened. But that's what happened was they added these barrels back to the market. But if you look and track it, basically every time they put an announcement, whether it's 500,000 barrels a day or it's 137,000 barrels a day, they're taking most of that, right? Saudi Arabia is taking most of that chunk. And essentially they were just bringing themselves back up to 10 million barrels per day for production. And that's essentially where the target is right now, and they're close to producing that now. Now, just for perspective, again, that puts them over 3.5 million barrels a day less than us, right? That's a lot. I mean, we really have to think about from a geopolitical framework, we are producing over 3.5 million barrels a day more than Saudi Arabia or Russia. So it's a huge geopolitical delta. And it does give this administration a lot of wiggle room to do things geopolitically. They wouldn't have been able to do all the stuff in the Middle East. They wouldn't have been able to, you can't drop bombs on Iran if you're not producing that much oil because you have to have some flexibility. Or you would have seen much higher prices. So it gives you so much geopolitical wiggle room. Obama started using this when we were raising oil output. He was able to put sanctions on countries. But really, these OPEC increases are largely about Saudi Arabia increasing. I will say that Iraq is now saying that they want a bigger quota. I would say that some of the crude that we're getting from Iraq is actually probably coming from Iran. The influence of Iran in Iraq has been very pervasive in the last several years. And so we're probably seeing barrels from Iran flooding into Iraq, and then we are getting them. That's a big no-no. That's very, very bad. Because what Iran does with all that money is they like to support in their extracurricular activities all these nefarious organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah and Houthis, and you just play whack-a-mole. So you need to keep Iran broke. This is a problem with Iraq. So when Iraq is starting to say this, and they just said this in the last meeting, so I think what you heard from the 137,000 barrels per day, which they agreed to in this last meeting, versus the 500,000 barrels a day, which you heard, that was another driver to push oil prices down. Again, they didn't pop back up after we didn't get that. So every time we get this negative sentiment, we never get the pop back, right? You got the trade stuff last Friday, and then it was okay, and the stock market went back up, but oil prices didn't. So oil prices are not getting the same kind of market reaction. They're just staying on the downside. But all this is about we're losing the market cohesion within OPEC, and so Saudi Arabia is taking back this market share. I also do think that Saudi Arabia is well aware that the Trump administration is going to have to sanction Russia, right? The only way you're going to end this war in Ukraine is if you break Russia, if you really, really hurt them economically. The only way you're going to be able to hurt them economically is if you they can't sell their crude oil, and that means higher oil prices. So if you are looking for a real scenario, I'm not saying a long-term, demand-driven scenario, but we could definitely have higher oil prices if we sanction Russia, and we should be sanctioning Russia. So we should be taking we could take a few million barrels a day off the market and support oil prices by just sanctioning Russia. And that would really go a long way into helping curb the revenue that they're getting to support this war in Ukraine. We just also heard that India apparently told Trump just last night or the day before that they're not going to purchase any more Russian crude. I mean, that's 2 million barrels a day that they have to supplant. China and India are both buying over 2 million barrels a day from Russia. So we're talking 4 million barrels a day that we would have to supplant from other countries. So we're not going to get rid of Iranian crude and Russian crude because nobody wants higher oil prices. But in order to take care of these countries, that's what we really need to do. And I think one of the ways that the Trump administration is thinking about this too is that, okay, well, we have lower prices, that will hurt them. But the problem is the Russian economy and the Russians are pretty resilient, right? Even with lower prices, unless you really break them, it's not going to break them, right? They can do a lot with very, very little. And I think we've seen that over the course of the last several years.
That's right. They took potatoes and made vodka, so they can do anything sometimes. Okay, so we're going to switch over to China a little bit. And let's talk about rare earth minerals. And I know we talked about lithium in a couple of speeches earlier today. So let me get your take on some of these rare earth minerals and where those are going, and electronics technology, all that stuff.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's the biggest elephant in the room is China, right? And that's the big weight that, every time we see the stock market and you can't look at the stock market for an indicator for the economy, but you can look at it for just the volatility. And so the China rare earth thing that happened last Friday, It's really interesting in terms of timing, right? Everyone's saying, why would they do this now? Well, our number one strategic adversary is absolutely China. I spend an inordinate amount of time researching, spending a lot of time on China. So next to oil prices, it's your biggest elephant in the room. If you are doing business in China or have a connection to them, I would say start looking to diversify. Okay, like you should have been doing that 5 years ago, but if you're still doing it now, get diversified. Because it's a massive risk. Because think about Russia. Think about if you had a business in Russia and then you had a war in Ukraine, you no longer have a business in Russia. And that's the trajectory that you're on with China. So when they do this rare earth card, basically they refine all the rare earths. So they're not that rare. We have lots of them. Magnets are the big component that everyone's been talking about. That's been a pretty big issue for auto manufacturers, is that use a lot of all these magnets in F-150 is just filled with them, right? And so you need them, and we didn't have enough. Everybody's been probably stockpiling to a degree, but we've essentially been able to get them from China. And now they came out on Friday and said, we're going to make sure everyone who gets anything with 0.1% of rare earths from China is going to have to get a license and approval from China. And people say, well, this probably wasn't Xi Jinping. No, it was absolutely Xi Jinping. Okay, so if you know anything about the Chinese government, there's no way something this big would have come out that he didn't have his hands touched on, that he wouldn't have complied with it or agreed with it. So absolutely. Now the question is why did they do this now? They clearly are playing a card, they want to negotiate, yada yada. There's a bunch of different stuff going on. But the reality is that no matter how you spin it, they are trying to decouple and we are trying to decouple, right? They don't want to be tied to us and we don't want to be tied to them. And that is because if we're tied, we can hurt each other. On the rare earth thing, it is really important is because they refine almost all of it. It's like 85 to 100% of all the rare earths they actually refine. That's important because think about it, on refining, we're great at refining crude oil. We have, China now has as much refining capacity as we do for crude oil, but outside of that, we're the largest crude oil refiner in the world. We have very, very sophisticated, heavy, complex refineries. We can take Canadian, heavy Canadian crude from the oil sands and we can turn it into awesome stuff and get a lot of diesel and get a lot of gasoline. We don't do that with rare earths, but we need to, right? So refining rare earths it's very energy intensive. It's very environmentally intensive. It requires, and so the biggest reason why no one else does it, energy, right? Why doesn't South Africa do it? Why don't we see countries in Africa doing it? They don't have the damn energy, right? So it comes down to energy. Well, what did I say? 3 cents a kilowatt hour. It's pretty damn cheap. That is because it's coming from coal-fired power generation. Add some forced labor and some other subsidies in there, you can get stuff really, really cheap in China. But and it is absolutely coming from forced labor. But the refining thing, that all comes down to energy. And you have to extract uranium, you have to extract thorium. It's very, very dirty. It's really messy. So that's what you're doing. Now, if anyone is getting serious about this, they need to say, hands up in the air, we will build a refinery here in the US and we will refine and process rare earths. That's what has to be done. And so the interesting thing is that it's pushing the rest of the world to do that. I don't have a lot of hope that Europe is going to come in and say, well, we're going to process rare earths anytime soon. Because Europe doesn't even want to, they don't even want to turn their lights on, let alone have reliable power. So I'm not thinking that Europe's going to come on board and say we're going to start processing rare earths. So you're going to need countries like in Indonesia, you're going to need India, you're going to need some other developing country that we're working with to start doing this. And there is a little bit of processing outside, but in terms of could we do it, we absolutely could. But that's where the trump card is right now, literally and figuratively, is that it's in rare earths of saying that the question is, why are they playing this now? And why are they playing it so hard? And are they easing into it? Is there something that obviously is going behind the scenes? We've been doing negotiations with China behind the scenes for several months, and clearly there's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes with that. We are trying to make sure they don't get sophisticated chips for artificial intelligence. We're keeping them pretty limited on the lower grade chips. They can do a lot with the lower grade chips, but they can't do the super, super sophisticated stuff. And China they're just exceptionally good, just like Russia is really good at brute forcing their way, sucky economy, sucky everything, but they can push through it. China's really, really good at just manufacturing and brute force industrial manufacturing policy through everything. And so if you think about that, how they work through economically things, what can you do with a lesser grade chip? Well, you can still do quite a bit. So this is interesting in terms of the timing of, there's clearly stuff going behind the scenes with the Trump administration where Xi Jinping thought he wanted to play, tough guy and actually do this. So people give Trump a lot of criticism for him playing tough guy, but I think this is one where, we definitely see China being a little bit, I'm saying overly aggressive, but they clearly are making it clear that they want to decouple as well.
Going back on the comment that you made, and I think this is pretty important, that forced labor is a big aspect over there. And so in the oil and gas industry, we've had a lot of layoffs coming about. I know it's not a complete correlation there, weird segue, but so our industry just as a whole, and I've been doing this about 20 years, it seems like we've got that the boom and bust situation is constant, and so there tends to be this age gap that's just missing because people leave, they get laid off, they leave the industry for whatever reason, and then never come back to oil and gas. So my theory is that AI may kind of segue some of that. So how do you feel about AI kind of coming in, taking some of these entry-level positions, and then what do we do about staffing as well?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think AI, you're seeing it already for white collar jobs, right? We're seeing tech companies, we're seeing tech companies they have less people employed because they're using artificial intelligence internally and they're not hiring as many people. Nestle's stock popped today because they said they're laying off 16,000 people, 12,000 I think quickly, and then another 4,000. The 12,000 are white collar jobs. The other 4,000 will be for the next several years. So 16,000 people, it's not an insignificant number. Not all this is artificial intelligence, but it's definitely, this is how you do more with less. So in the oil industry, I don't think it's all necessarily artificial intelligence. I think the oil industry knows that, when we had $83, we had $80-something oil a couple of years ago, they acted like it was 60. And so, they've been wanting to, streamline and lose these jobs for a long time. The problem is that I think the oil industry speaks out of both sides of their mouths, and so you have, hey, we need people educated, and we need to fight this good fight, and we need better education, but they won't pay for it, right? They're not gonna. I know, because I worked at a nonprofit and I know what I do for a living. They'll talk about the big game, but they're not going to pay anyone to actually go write the paper to say what's actually happening in energy. They just want to complain about it. And on the people side, they need to be very careful, is because when you're doing these mass layoffs, and then in a couple of years you complain that we have no young engineers work at these companies. And I think I have seen a lot of companies talk a lot about automation, right? It wasn't necessarily artificial intelligence they were talking about a couple years ago, but they do talk a lot about automation and automation this and automation that, and we're going to complete all our wells the same. Well, that's not going to work, right, forever, right? That might work for some companies, but I do think the basins are different, the rock's different, and it's that individual touch that we give these wells in each basin and that frac design and that completion design that's going to make that pop. And increasingly, that's what's going to differentiate you, and that's what's going to matter if you want to stay ahead of your peers. So I think these layoffs, I don't think are the best move. And I think that it's oil and gas. It's an extractive industry. You cannot artificially your intelligence. You can get a lot. We could get some amazing learnings in terms of getting more productivity from the rock, from AI. But it is a safety business, and you better have people in the field. So I wonder if we're getting a little bit over our skis in terms of layoffs. Now, globally, if you think about all the stuff of how depressed the North Sea is, how much we don't produce nearly as much oil and gas in Europe as we used to. So that's stuff you can sort of expect. In the US, you're streamlining, so you see some of that. And then you've just seen so much M&A that, they had all this stuff and they have, multiple positions, right? So they're cleaning up there. But it's not a good look for the industry. Honestly, and I'm not saying you should employ people just to employ people. I'm not advocating for that, but it's not a really good look in terms of what you're telling the market, how you're seeing the market. And I say this because the oil and gas industry has not been vocal. They spent 4 years during the Biden administration duck and covering and telling their shareholders they were ESG friendly and they had, CO2 emissions targets and they were going net zero and a lot of, BS. And now they just went silent on that, and now they're just, now they're doing their layoffs and everything. Why don't you just tell your story? Why don't you tell me why I should invest in your company? Tell me that you drill for oil and gas. Tell me how you do it. Tell me where you do it. Tell me why you do it effectively. And focus on drilling for oil and gas and doing it well and making money in the core businesses that you make money in, as opposed to going off onto all this fringy stuff. And I think that not everyone has followed that true to track. And so this is where, the rubber meets the road when you get $57 oil, and the companies that perform well, it's usually they're executing really, really well. And at $80-something oil, they were putting the drill bit into the ground and they were drilling for oil and gas. And now they're probably, they're cleaning up a little bit and slowing down or doing whatever. But, in these cycles, we always see this. And I'm not saying, this is where the layoffs I get a little bit nervous about too, is that in all these cycles, it's never proven that if you just drop a bunch of people and you stop drilling and you stop completing wells, that you actually save money. It's not been proven, because you drop everything, and then when you have to ramp up, you do it when it's really expensive. So you're much better off keeping things really steady. And that's why I kind of emphasize the $67 barrel of oil over the course of this year. Despite all that volatility, we've been close to $70 a barrel. And if you ran your business like that, you wouldn't be nearly as panicked as a lot of folks seem to be panicked right now.
Yeah, that is one of the problems with this industry, is they like to panic and they like to make quick decisions as soon as pricing drops or rises up. So let's continue AI though. That was a big topic today. Let's talk about power demand and then projections for power demand. We've got these data centers that we know are going to have to be built. We've got locations out there for them. Are we aligned to bring these online, and what are those capacities?
So I don't think so. It's a really big, broad topic, and it's hard to wrap your arms around. But I would say you could just see, if you're turning on the TV and you're seeing all the investment stuff, right, from OpenAI to NVIDIA, there's a lot of circular investing. That's what's getting people a little bit nervous about the AI bubble talk, that things are a little bubblicious, is that, there's a lot of kind of almost circular accounting, right? This company is investing in this company, who's investing in this company, who's tied back to that company. And it's all like three companies. It's like Intel, that's new to the game, NVIDIA, OpenAI, and NVIDIA, OpenAI, circular, doing this over and over and over again. So, but the big problem is that what we see in the power side, and I would say that this is important for our Dallas community, is that you have a lot of folks here with, this is a massive, awesome financial hub where people understand minerals well, they understand nat gas well, they invest in this stuff, right? This is the place where people were long nat gas before it was cool to be long nat gas. Now, we have to be, I really caution folks to think about understanding that. Why are you long nat gas? What is your thinking about natural gas? Because if you're just hoping that AI is going to be that savior, there's a lot of things that are driving that. And so this drill, baby drill, and all this stuff from the administration, we didn't say in the beginning, was that, it is real, right? The thing that natural gas, the signals that natural gas is getting, as much as it is AI, it's about LNG exports. It's that this administration is approving LNG export permits, and that we're going to have a growth in LNG exports. And that's going to drive long-term demand growth for natural gas. It's going to give a home for all this excess gas. The problem is we're really, really good at producing it. And that's where I say that Wall Street Journal article that came out, I think it was yesterday, was so poor, is because basically it just said, hey, we're not going to be able to make the math work. I can tell you, whenever you get above, we're producing so much natural gas right now, and so when you're above $3 an MCF, because we were at $2 an MCF in 2024, $3 just felt really, really good. And so production has been up, right? And so you're giving that market signal. So for AI, the problem is that I struggle between the molecule at the wellhead to this light bulb, right? And to all the AI that is taking from this light bulb, is that we have to get that all together. And so that value chain, and when I'm in Washington and they ask me about this, I tell folks, you have to invest in infrastructure. Natural gas has to be processed. Unlike coal, where I can have a rock and I can stack it up by the power plant and I can just burn it whenever, I have to process natural gas. Every form of natural gas, I cannot. I can put it in CNG, but I need to pipeline it from the wellhead to wherever it needs to go. And then I have to take out the NGLs, and I got to do everything. There's a bunch of things that happen to have natural gas. It's awesome, but it needs infrastructure. And so I have to be investing in this infrastructure. And that's why you're seeing midstream is pretty hot right now, is because everybody knows that, forget where oil, they know that we're going to demand natural gas, and they know that we're going to demand oil, which should make you think that oil price shouldn't be as low as they are. But as hot as midstream is now, that's because they believe in the long term for oil and natural gas, and that you need the infrastructure. But we're not investing enough in terms of the infrastructure of the actual power generation. And that's because, so they're building the AI stack, they're building all this stuff, and they're saying we have the demand, but we don't have the power. And so we're very, very offside on that. And then the problem is okay, then people say, okay, we're going to need all this power. And they think it's gonna, I think the nat gas community, and I'm not saying everyone, but I feel like the nat gas community thinks it's probably a little higher than it actually is, right? That we're gonna need boatloads of natural gas. And the actual equivalent from nat gas to the GPUs and to how much we're gonna take from AI is probably a little bit less than we're actually thinking, because we're gonna get more efficient at it, right? We're going to get better at it. And that's what we do from a technology standpoint, is we just get a little better. So I feel like we have some disconnects. I think the power demand is massive, absolutely massive, but we need to get more nat gas into the electricity pool as it is, and we need to get those savings passed along to the consumer, and we need to be building the infrastructure direct from nat gas to AI as we speak, and not enough of that is happening. And you're getting a lot of stuff that's kind of, you're seeing frac companies very, very invested, very involved on the power side. You wouldn't have that business if utilities had done their job, and they haven't done their job.
We did want to open up, if y'all have any questions, to the room, if y'all have anything. Yeah, go ahead. Right here in the front.
Thank you. Amazing insights. It's been quite insightful hearing from you, and also inspiring. I have two questions actually. In the past 1 year, I've spent time studying different technologies, mostly renewable energy technologies and technologies for decarbonization. And I found out that the rate of penetration is very, very high. For the first time this year, solar has just overtaken coal. So looking at these particular scenarios, improvement in technologies, new emergence of new technologies, where do you see the price of gas and oil between now and the next 10 years? That's my number one question. I don't know if you want to answer that before I ask the second question, or do you want me to ask the both questions at the same time?
Yeah, you can ask the next one.
Okay, my second question would be rare earth minerals. Last year, late last year, I was in a session with the U.S. ambassador to the Congo, Republic of the Congo, Congo DRC. So, and I pointed out something about what's going on right now in the world in terms of geoeconomics and geopolitics of rare earth minerals. And that's the fact that over the years, China silently built very solid partnerships with African countries, with South American countries like Chile and the likes, and they were able to understand the technology, the politics, and dominated this very crucial and critical area. And it's like US is not doing enough in terms of global partnerships. And I'm so surprised when US say they're trying to do something about it. Do you think US will be able to catch up? Do you think they'll be able to do anything about it? Knowing the fact that China has built very solid relationships, very solid diplomatic relationships across the countries that really own these materials. And if you think so, what do you think could be the best strategy for the United States of America to be able to advance their interests and also be able to combat, or can I say tackle, or like you use the word decouple from China, as the case may be?
Yeah, so I'm going to break your heart, I'm not as ecstatic about wind and solar. I'm just not. Now, I think there are cases where they can be used, but I'm not a fan of making them in China with forced labor at all. I think the forced labor is a bigger problem than coal. I'm oil and gas, and I heart coal, and I want a bumper sticker that says that. I think coal is super underappreciated in the global economy. But and if we had more coal in Africa, we could solve a lot of problems. If we could just utilize it, we could solve a lot of problems. I spend a lot of time thinking about these countries that are very tied with China, and China has built deep-seated relationships with Latin America, with Africa, and it started with things like oil and very simplistic, things like, hey, we needed oil, and then it grew into, and you have rare earths, and you have all these things, and we'll give you money, and we don't care about your human rights or whatever you're doing politically, and we just kind of have this trade. That's how China works. But China also, you have to be very careful. It's like China, they don't work within the rules and norms. Like our rules and norms that we think are profitability, right? Something as basic as like human rights, when they don't comply with that, they're not going to comply with decarbonization, right? They're not going to comply with CO2 emissions. But they don't work within the rules and norms as we do. Actually, quite within the bounds of their rules and norms is cheating. Like literally cheating out, playing outside, coloring outside the lines. That's how China does business, because that's okay with them. So we're competing, we're not competing one-to-one. And so you have to be thinking about that way. And so I think the way that we do it with these other countries, it's hard because you have to get them, Argentina, I know everyone's really excited about Argentina. They're very excited about the Vaca Muerta. We've been excited about the Vaca Muerta for 20 years. But now you see this renewed excitement because people want something outside the Permian. Except we just bailed out the peso again. And we just bailed out Argentina again. And this is something that happens every 10, 15, 20 years. We just bail them out. So the above ground issues are really serious. And so you have to be able to say, okay, I know these above ground risks. Can I work with these countries? Can I make this work? I actually think energy is a big one of those. So we have enough coal and we have enough natural gas in the US to work with, to have agreements with all these countries and say, we will supply you with natural gas, we will backstop it with coal, and you will get all these implicit security guarantees that come when our vessels traverse the water, and so we will give you energy. That is a fundamental way to cripple the foundational relationship that China has with these countries. Because we start saying, okay, well, gosh, you want to do business with China? Maybe we you don't have this energy. Well, it allows us to build these relationships with these countries, allows these countries to build industries and manufacturing, and it allows them to kind of push away from China a little bit. So I think that's a big one. As to where the oil prices are going in the next 2-3 years, I think we are 60 to 70 is definitely a trajectory we could be at for a long time. I think we can easily go, I think 75 is going to feel amazing when we go back there. But I don't think we're at 40 to 50. I don't think we're on the downside. I think 60 to 70 is very realistic. And I think we could actually even be a little bit higher if we take seriously this dealing with Russia. But there was a lot in there. You want to squeeze in another one?
Yeah, I think we can get in one more question. Yes, go ahead. Hand up. Yeah.
How do you feel about refining in the U.S., especially with a lot of closures over the last 2 years, and kind of what the future is with the optics?
Like just the business of refining oil in the U.S.?
Kind of the future of refining, because it's been declining, right? That doesn't help.
I mean, so refining is a thin margin business, right? It's the refinery is buying the crude oil and then they're processing it, and so those spreads, that crack spread, the margins that they're getting, it's always been a thin margin business. And if you execute and run it well, you can do pretty well. We invested really heavily, our refineries invested super heavily in coking capacity here in the Gulf Coast. And they're the best in the world, right? They're really, really good. But you have to have a long view. And, this is where it's really, really important is that we are the best in the world of refining. There's 3 major places, like Singapore, Rotterdam, and the Netherlands, and the Gulf Coast. And it does help set crude oil prices, right? If we produce a ton of diesel and we don't use all that diesel, we're going to put pressure on oil prices. So I wouldn't say I'm like bullish on it, but I can say from a national security perspective, it is very, very, very important. So in that sense, I think you can get comfortable with it because you cannot afford in the US to get it wrong, right? Like we can't afford to not have refining capacity. And I say that because I don't know anyone, I've looked at the data and I updated Chinese data. They are now they have as much refining capacity as we do, which is fascinating because they don't consume as much oil as we do. So why the hell do they need as much refining capacity as we do? And that is because they want it as a buffer and they want to stockpile. And they could also want to just dump the market and actually hurt us. And if I'm China and I'm thinking about what do I do to the US? Well, the US is the largest oil and gas producer in the world. So I could potentially hurt them just like I do in rare earths. But it's really, really important to get right because whether we're in a wartime situation or allies are, you want to actually have that. But just for like keeping your economy humming and running, even when we were producing 4.8 million barrels a day during the Obama administration, in 2008, we still had 18 million barrels a day plus refining capacity. We've maintained that refining capacity, but it's super, super critical to maintain that refining capacity. So these fires and things that we see, can't have those, right? You got to be running your business as well, and you got to maintain this stuff. It's people don't like it, but it's a super nerdy, super cool. It's the chemistry side. It's put the stuff in a distillation column, heat this up. Like it is the awesome side of the business that's very, very underappreciated. So the one thing I would say in our business is that we need to do a better job is understanding how the whole value chain from the upstream to the midstream to the downstream to the refining, and then all the stuff tangentially, like understanding that natural gas, we need coal. Natural gas is not nearly as awesome if we don't have that backstop for coal to offset it when we have these price spikes. So we need to do a better job of this business of understanding holistically and embracing like other parts of the business. So absolutely 100%. If I'm upstream, I want to be a big fan of downstream. And that's why I think you're looking at like Oxy and some of these companies is that, integrated businesses, you have to be careful about, we over time in history, we integrate and then we disintegrate and we sell them off for whatever the cycles are doing. But typically you ebb through the cycles and you go back and then you do it again.
So to kind of go off of that, I know that we have like two refineries in California that are closing by the end of April of next year. Is that going to affect us at all, or is that more just it was programmed, we knew that was going to happen, and there's been accommodations other places for it?
No, I think it's a big deal. We haven't added refining capacity, right? So you need to be, California dropped a lot of refining capacity. So during COVID, we lost like over 1 million barrels a day refining capacity. Actually more than that, and then it came back, but most of that was California because everybody during COVID leaned into let's go green and let's not have oil anymore, which was stupid and not realistic. But that's what California did. So California is super anti-oil, but they're PAD 5. It's Petroleum Administration Defense District 5. It's a wartime terminology from World War II, and they're a major refining district. But the problem is, they lose refining capacity, well, they have some of the highest gasoline prices in the country anyway, but it means it has ripple effects across the U.S. economy, and just having that refining capacity. So if California doesn't have it, we need to offset it within the Gulf Coast. And the reality is it's very, very difficult to build a new refinery. And that's why partly is because we've been so efficient over the last 20 years that we haven't actually had to build new ones because we're so good at it. But we've also can't get a permit for one, so you're forced to do really well at your existing refinery. And then it's really hard to just get a permit to even expand your refinery. So when we started producing all this crude oil in the US, 2008 onward, all these refineries had to adapt to a lot of this light sweet crude, and they're taking all this light sweet crude in, and they got all these light ends, and they got to do something with it. These are engineering challenges within a refinery, but they addressed them, right? It took them years, but they addressed them. I mean, the East Coast refineries were taking Nigerian crude. Now at a time they were taking Bakken crude. Now we hardly get any Nigerian crude in the U.S. Because we were able to move around this. These are all technological feats we can fix, but no, bar none, you don't want to lose any refining capacity. And you want to be, if anything, you want to be adding, you want to make sure you keep your nameplate and then you want to add to it. But if we lose it in California, it's got to be offset somewhere else.
Okay, I think that is our time for here. Thank you so much. This has been a great experience. It's been great questions, great answers. She's going to be here for the rest of the day, right? So if you have any other questions that you want to ask, we can do that outside during some of the networking breaks. But thank you so much for being here, Trisha.
Thank you, guys.